Hello and welcome to another joint episode of the Lib Dem Podcast and the Never Mind the Bar Charts podcast. My name is John Potter. I'm a councillor here in Preston in Lancashire, and I am the host of the Lib Dem Podcast. Joining me for this very special episode is, of course, the host of the Never Mind the Bar Charts podcast, President Mark Pike. Hello, Mark. Good morning.
Good morning, John. Lovely to join you once again.
And we've brought an extra person just in case I mess up, which is probably likely to happen. We have Tom Morrison, who was our target candidate in Cheadle at the general election, and is also a councillor in Stockport. Morning, Tom.
Morning. How you doing, both?
Nice to see you as well, Tom.
Yes.
Now, we have lots of things to discuss with our party president, because, there's been a lot happening. And I think the logical first place to start is obviously the leadership election. So, I mean, from your point of view, Mark, the not talking about the result in any way, but actually, how did you think the leadership election went from an organisational point of view?
I think everyone is glad that it's over. It felt like there was controversy, as we've spoken before, about when it was run. But then once we kicked it off, I think everyone's feedback is pretty much going to be, it felt like it took a long time. And I think there's a general lesson for us there, that the reason it took as long as it did, from, okay, we are now running it, through to my 3-sentence speech announcing the winner, is that our rules are very prescriptive in the details, and they set down lots of timescales and so on. And I think in a world where, as we've discovered, it's possible to do an awful lot more online than it used to be, some of those old assumptions no longer apply. I think one thing that did turn out pretty well was the new style of online hustings, both doing them online. Overall, in as much as you can compare video views with physical attendance in a room, but overall it looks like more people watched hustings than went to them before, and actually a lot of people viewed more than one husting. So that bit I think worked really well. What also I think worked quite well was the format. It's interesting that the regionally based hustings, some of them I think worked really well. There's clearly a logic in having a Scottish hustings and a Welsh hustings, but quite a lot of members seem to have commented that the large number of regional hustings within England, it felt like it was the same questions pretty much being asked to all of them. And and maybe we should have had more hustings, looking at particular policy themes and so on. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the full feedback is. But my impression is that the things that we changed the most went best, and the things where we were most traditionally what we did were probably the things that were the least successful. I don't know what both you and Tom felt of how it went.
Well, Tom chaired the Northwest hustings and the Liberal Reform hustings. So actually you had a foot in both camps. Actually, you had a more of a kind of a policy-driven one and a kind of a regional one, Tom. So how did you think the hustings went?
I think Mark's spot on there. I think the case for regional hustings, when you have that kind of physical hustings kind of setting, that's where it's needed, because it's a geographical location where people can get to. But actually, what I found was the Northwest hustings, although it was wonderfully chaired, I've got to say, the questions were very similar to the other regional hustings. The one I found the most interesting was the Liberal Reform one, because there was just a bit of nuance around kind of the economic policy. There was a really good discussion on planning and housing, and those things that were really important to the Liberal Reform team. So I actually thought those kind of issue-based or kind of like group within the Liberal Democrats-based hustings worked a lot better than the regional ones.
And actually what I think worked really nicely about not only the Liberal Reform hustings, but others like the Social Liberal Forum as well, those where there was a bit of a particular, almost ideological bent, is that you knew the candidates both wanted to play to the audience, but also that there was a whole bigger audience out there that might have different views. And I think that balancing act is a really important balancing act. Not just our leader, but all politicians have to pull off. And so I thought the way that you could see with both Ed and Layla, I thought at various times they were sort of torn between giving the Liberal Reform friendly answer, but also thinking they're also Social Liberal Forum members who I'm also wanting to vote for me. And I think that worked really well. As you say, I wonder if what would have worked better is if we'd not had a Northwest hustings per se, but a hustings maybe on education, and then said, right, and now we've got a 15-minute slot for questions specifically about the Northwest. That might have focused people on those. Because there obviously are some, Northern Rail would be a good example, I guess, of an issue that should come up in hustings, but is easy to get a bit lost otherwise. You know, if we had a 15-minute slot where people just focused on those sorts of issues, that might, maybe, I don't know, maybe that would work better in future.
And do we think there were too many? I mean, I think there were over 40 in the end. And also, I wanted to ask you, Mark, about the timings of the hustings as well, because for me, the campaign lost a lot of energy once ballot papers were out. And I completely understand that. Obviously, you have to give time for people to fill it out and return it, particularly those who are doing it by post. But it certainly, I mean, I think it was, 2 weeks before the end, and had a lot of hustings after that. And it did feel a little bit after the Lord Mayor's show. But there's no real way we could get around that, is there?
No, I mean, the basic organisational dilemma is twofold. One is, if you want all the hustings before the ballot papers go out, that pushes ballot papers going out back, you know, because you've got to have some time to get in a whole burst of hustings. It also, therefore, means the ballot paper period itself just can become very dull. And that leads to the second problem, which is we do have members overseas and some of them are not online. So we have, well, our assumption is, and I think it's the right one, but obviously, you know, it's an assumption I guess some people might want to challenge, but I think it's the right assumption, is we have to allow enough time for overseas post to both go out and come back. And that, you know, that is not a trivial amount of time. So I think the minimum amount of time the polls can be open for is never going to be as short as, in a sense, instinctively we would like.
And I think what wasn't helped, Tom, just before I bring you in, is the fact we did have a bit of a phony war before the actual contest kicked off. I mean, everyone knew Ed was going to stand. Everyone knew Layla was going to stand. And so it felt like months before even the actual contest started, which probably led to a little bit of this has been going on forever because we were all preparing for it. But Tom, what I mean, as well as chairing the hustings, what did you make of the actual kind of the organisation? I thought it seemed to go quite seamlessly. I mean, I did have one of my members receive 2 ballots. That was, but actually, generally, I thought it was pretty seamless. I didn't hear of too many issues. Did you, Tom, have any issues that you want to pass on to Mark?
No, not at all. I thought it was really, really well managed. And I think there was a point where the ballots started arriving and people didn't know, and then they appeared in junk boxes. But that's the stuff you can't really account for that. I thought it was really seamless, and the team did a superb job in just managing that. The thing that I'd be really interested in, Mark, is just following on from the previous discussion we just had about the length of the campaign. Is there any kind of statistics that show when people voted? Did people vote within 48 hours, or did people hold on to it?
You basically get 2 spikes, as I think we did again with this election, which is immediately after the ballots go out and just before the deadline. And so, and actually this partly comes back to your point earlier, John, is that certainly in a close contest, the election is still very much up for grabs 3 or 4 days after the ballots have gone out, because although you've had a big spike of people voting, there's still a whole chunk of people out there who haven't yet voted, many of whom will. And so in a lot of our contests, actually, that second wave of voting is the one that's determined the result. I think, I mean, what we don't know is if we had a much shorter period, and therefore it's you get your ballot paper and you have to fill it out by the end of tomorrow. It's like, you know, in an extreme, for example, I guess, you know, you would get that huge burst. But there is a bit of, it takes time for people to realise, oh, I should have had my ballot and I've not, and maybe I should look in junk, or maybe I should post on social media complaining I've not had my ballot, and then Greg or someone at HQ can respond saying, have you looked in junk? You know, I think, you know, as well as the overseas voters and, you know, the postal issues there is some value in having voting for a bit of a period. What I genuinely don't know, and it'd be really interesting to hear feedback from any listeners on this, is it seemed like this time there were a lot more people saying that they'd not had their ballot, and then somebody popped up, maybe one of the 3 of us, to reply to say, have you looked in junk? This is who it's from. And then they found it. That seemed to be a much bigger problem. That might be that social media has just made it easier for people to flag a problem and for the likes of us to all be helpful to colleagues. Or it might be that genuinely there was a bigger issue with that. I think the stats from HQ suggest that it was probably more greater awareness. But I think it's the sort of thing we should never be complacent about, because if we've got that problem with a ballot email of all, and imagine what's happening to all of our local party newsletter emails, for example, where you've not got anything like that focused on, did you get it? Here's how you can find it, etc.
And I suppose, Mark, you've raised HQ. I mean, it'll be really. I'd love to hear from you. How did the staff cope with it? Were there any additional logistics issues? Or I mean, obviously you praised them in your short speech before you announced the winner. But were those challenges overcome? Were they greater? Were they lesser? Yeah. How was the contest for staff?
Yeah, I mean, the key members of staff running the leadership election, it was from all but one of them, it was their first leadership election, first internal election that they'd run. And so full credit to them for doing a really good job. I think there was obviously a fair amount of controversy about a couple of issues that went to the returning officer for returning officer ruling. I think there's definitely, some things we need to think about what is the extent to which the election rules should cover behaviour versus to what extent should we say the election rules only cover this bit and everything else is for other people to argue over, deal with, etc. So we will have our usual post-election review of the process. I expect that it will be at a relatively gentle pace because fingers crossed, we're not going to have a leadership election too. And also, it's not like we've got other big internal elections for party president or federal committees coming around. So I guess it will be at a relatively gentle pace. But the upshot of that would be that if we have got any rules revisions, they would come to conference at some point, I would have thought next year. So there's definitely a chance for members to sort of input their views on that. I think the other thing I would say is not only the thanks to the staff, thank you to all the volunteers, people like Tom and many other people who chaired hustings, or even if you were just one of those people who occasionally popped up a message on social media to remind members you should have had your ballot and here's what to do if you've not, everyone, huge numbers of people in different ways contributed towards the outcome. And of course the other thing is regardless of who anyone wanted to win, a clear result is always helpful. That it means that the gremlins there were, like the member that you mentioned earlier, John, there isn't any doubt that gremlin didn't therefore impact the election result. I may have put too many negatives in that sentence, but you know what I mean.
No, that was fine.
Quadruple negative.
I was going to look this up, Mark, but I thought there's no way you're not going to know this. This statistic.
I'm reaching for my mouse to look something up now.
It's about turnout. And there was some people saying, the turnout was poorer than what we expected. Now, how on a historical basis of Lib Dem leaderships, how was the turnout? Just so people.
It was up on 2015 and down on 2017. So I think the turnout I would describe as fine. I wouldn't say it was brilliant, nor would I say, oh, woe is us, disaster awaits. And I don't think we should be complacent about that. I think there's a range of reasons why people will have not voted. And one of them, which I think was more prevalent this time, anecdotally, but seems to be more prevalent, was actually a fair number of people who thought, I quite like both. There's not a killer reason for one rather than the other. So I think there was a bit of, I just can't decide about it, or I can't decide and it's an important choice and I've not got time to sit down and watch another hustings for an hour. So there's almost something honourable about not voting in that sense. If you feel, okay, I'll leave it to others. But nonetheless, we shouldn't be complacent that there is clearly, a big task to keep members engaged in the year after you've had a very disappointing general election result like we did. And also, of course, it's a year where most of the things that we normally use to get members involved, we're not able to do. Coronavirus and the sort of the inability to get out on the doorsteps, the inability to hold local party events where people physically get, there's a big engagement challenge that we all need to play our part in the coming months.
Tom, what did you find in Cheadle about turnout? Were people enthused? I did hear from one member in Lancashire who just said, again, because it had been going on for so long, just went, I'm fed up with it, and I ended up just abstaining on it. But what was the feeling in Cheadle?
Just from the kind of the members I spoke to, I think I'd be really interested to find out if there was a way of finding out the turnout within a specific local party. But I think our members made their mind up quite early on. We were in the fortunate place where both candidates had come to us prior to the actual election starting. And already kind of built a rapport with the members here. So it was mostly what I heard was people voted within the first 3 days and then went, I don't care about it now. And then I want to go and knock on doors or deliver leaflets. So that's basically how that happened.
And I suppose it's important to realise that I think the Labour leadership, Keir Starmer's victory, I think only had 62% turnout. So I actually don't know what the Boris Johnson leadership election kind of returns were for the Conservatives.
The Tory one was higher, but if I remember correctly, the Tories still do a postal ballot, and I think that is a little bit different. That if you post, so if something lands on your doormat, that is more intrusive in your life than if email lands in your inbox. Yeah. And so I think, it's not quite comparing like with like. I think you're right. There is a general, it's just a feature of humanity about turnout in internal elections in organisations, not just political parties. Yeah. It is very common for people to be very happily a member of an organisation, to be handing over money to it, and to choose not to take part in an internal ballot. It's just why people choose to participate is a much more subtle thing, I guess, than it always reminds me, although this isn't an electoral example, of this really curious professor there was when I was doing my PhD in the history department there was this chap who came to every departmental meeting and never said anything. And you sort of think, what's but it's that sense of being part of something and yet not participating can be a very, it's a normal thing for lots of humans to do. That applies with member organisations and internal ballots as well.
And I'm sure Mark won't mind me giving it a plug, but Mark has done several episodes on the Never Mind the Bar Charts podcast with Professor Tim Bale, who talks about membership. They're very good to go back and listen to, talking about the structures and what kind of people make up political parties. So there you go, Mark. Free plug.
Excellent. That was, Tim's book with colleagues on the foot soldiers, which is based on some quite detailed study, not only of political party membership, but I think the thing that makes the book really good is they also looked at strong supporters of parties. And so what's the difference between a strong supporter of the Lib Dems and a strong supporter who also chooses to join? And that one of the things that Tim finds, which I think, again, we should always remember, is that there's something about political party membership that disproportionately appeals to people like us, i.e. white men. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why, I've been very keen on the racial supporter scheme, for example, is that there is something inherent about party membership across parties. It's not, this isn't just about the Lib Dems, that just appeals disproportionately to one slice of the population. And if we want to really represent the whole country and all, really bring to life our beliefs in inequality and so on, we need to alter that a bit.
So the next point that comes that we should have to touch on regarding the leadership contest was there has been, and we're all three of us will be aware, a minority of people who were disappointed with the result and have either threatened to leave or have left. Now, Mark, what would be your, not pitch to them, but what would you say to them if you think, well, I was really hoping for a different result?
I mean, disappointment is very understandable after an election. And I think the disappointment is often sort of almost psychologically all the sharper when it's an internal contest. Yeah. Because, if you lose an election, a public election, you can sort of direct that anger at the other party, or perhaps unwisely but understandably at those stupid voters. You can express the anger, you can direct that outwards. In an internal election, you can only direct it inwards. So I think it is often a feature of internal elections that they feel particularly hurtful if you don't get the result that you like. What I would say is that if you look at previous, even really sharply contested internal elections, the sort of wounds do heal quite quickly. And it's notable how well Ed and Layla actually get on with each other, which is a really good sort of bit of leadership from both of them from the top in that respect. And, I think, if people's initial reaction is, oh my goodness, I just want out, then I can understand that. What I hope is that people sort of are willing to give us a second look, even if, you think, okay, I just don't want anything to do with that lot for a while. just, I hope you'll give us a second look in a few months' time when you're seeing how things are going, which is why I think, although there have been one or two of the more extreme comments that have maybe made me bridle a little bit in what people have sometimes said, I think, the way to respond is just with politeness and with empathy. Even if in the middle of the expression of frustration, people have sometimes used some words that go a little bit far. And it's worth bearing in mind. I mean, I had this experience with one person, and I'll try to keep this reasonably anonymous to not sort of, in case they would rather I didn't pick on them, but who has crossed swords with me on Twitter. I've crossed swords with them on Twitter a few times previously, and the Twitter algorithm just happened to throw up that, on my timeline, that they were leaving the party. And I thought, well, it'd be churlish just to ignore it. And so I sent, a polite reply back along similar lines to what I've just said. And actually, I was quite pleasantly surprised how kind their response back in turn was. That I think once you can get beyond the initial very understandable disappointment, it's worth saying, yeah, okay, look, let's just we can wish each other the best, and hopefully our paths will converge again at some point in the future.
And this comes back, I mean, any of us who canvass, that's the kind of how you deal with voters as well, in the terms of if you respond with negativity or prickliness or anything like that, you tend to drive them further away. And and for us that survived coalition on councils and things like that, know that we lost members, we lost voters at the time, and actually you can either stick it to them or just wish them well, and eventually they'll hopefully come back. Because if you make it, and this is where the Corbynistas are getting it completely wrong, they're saying, as soon as Keir Starmer got elected, I saw some of them saying, right, it's time to end this party. And you're just not helping the situation. Yeah. But, I mean, Tom, you obviously, but for a couple of thousand votes, you would be in Westminster right now. For those who don't know, Tom was the number one target candidate of the whole of the Northwest. So how do you deal with that kind of disappointment? And what have you said to maybe people who have been? Because, I mean, I voted Layla. But I made a point of, when I said I was supporting Layla, saying that whoever wins, I thought would be a good leader. I just, in my personal opinion, I thought Layla might do that little bit extra. So how have you dealt with it, Tom?
So I think it's in terms of myself, I think it's just kind of getting people to understand that actually this was just a very minor battle. The big thing is holding this government to account, and and winning seats and winning elections that way. I think there was obviously, and Mark's spot on, there's raw disappointment, and anyone who's lost an election will understand that kind of feeling of disappointment, that feeling of anger. And sometimes it's up to the winning side to be the first to open their palm and kind of bring people in and listen and that kind of stuff. The other thing that I'd probably want to say is that that there was so little difference between the two candidates. It seems. So that's where I kind of bristle, and I have to stop myself kind of responding on Twitter and things like that, because it doesn't matter to me. Like, they were both brilliant candidates. They both would have made brilliant leaders. So they're both, we win either way as a party. And the only way I can kind of think about it is, if you support a football team and your manager goes with one striker and not the other, you don't look at the team sheet and go, right, I'm not supporting this team anymore. Like, you don't do that. So I think we need to allow those people to kind of, take maybe a bit of time to, kind of get their heads around it, have a think, but then also we need the other side to kind of be more proactive in listening and showing a bit more empathy and bringing those people in, because the important thing is holding the government to account and getting rid of this Conservative government and winning council seats, because when the Lib Dems win, our residents win, and that's what we need to start focusing on.
Yep, absolutely, well said.
And we'll move on a little bit now from the contest to what's happened since. And I think from my point of view, Mark, I'm really interested. Like I said, I realise I'm a bit of a Lib Dem nose, as we might expect. But what has happened between yourself, the chief exec, and the leader since the contest? What's been this process now? I imagine Ed is feeling a lot better, because being an interim leader is always had like one hand behind his back. So what has changed since the actual contest?
Well, I think what is, I guess, relatively straightforward in that sense is that not only Ed as leader, but Rhiannon is his chief of staff. She's been staying on. Is that in that sense, it's been relatively easy to pick up things because it's sort of a group of people who were working together, albeit, as you rightly say, in slightly different roles earlier in the year. I think one of the really clear things from the Thornhill review is about, me and Ed and Mike, we all need to be clear about what our job is and also what our job isn't. And maybe all the more so the latter, if you look at some of the things that the Thornhill review picked up on. And I think it's quite helpful in that respect, in that the sorts of things that, if you look at what Ed said in his manifesto and what I said in my manifesto, we're talking about quite different tasks. I am not the public front man. That is not the sort of role that I, excel in, or seek. And that's why I stood for party president rather than, standing to try and get selected instead of Tom, say, as a PPC, So I'm quite optimistic on that basis that, I think we've got, between the three of us, people who've got quite, different interests, skills, perspectives, and that's quite useful. Obviously, we need to be mindful of the fact that we're not the most diverse trio, and therefore it's really important in all that we're doing that we don't end up slipping into habits of it being a very undiverse group. Because also, it's not just the obvious issues, in terms of, for example, we're all men, but also you look at, we're all from London as well, that we need to make sure. And that's why it's great that, for example, we have Lisa, councillor up in the Northwest, as chair of the elections committee now. That adds a really helpful, different perspective. And we need to always be working at that full diversity to make sure that our decisions and discussions are better.
Tom, is there anything you want to bring up on this?
I think that I think the thing about the three roles is, and kind of what you said there is the most important thing, is what your roles are not, and that is really interesting, because I think, and as a former parliamentary candidate and also someone who worked for the party, I think that kind of blurring between the lines of who is in charge of what has always been there, and I think that that means that I mean, from my own experience, I've seen both a chief exec, party president, and a party leader kind of stray into territory or kind of organisational kind of issues where that's caused problems, not just kind of for an external communications point of view, but for an internal comms point of view, where kind of campaign staff or headquarters staff kind of get confused about what's going on. So I think that's really important, is that kind of structure that we can start getting in place, where if there is a particular issue or a particular problem, that falls on the plate of Mark, for instance, or if there's another problem, it goes to the leader's office. I think that's really important going forward. Absolutely.
And I think part of that is all three of us need to be good at our jobs, because I think one of the things that, can drag people into doing things that are, in a sense, stepping on someone else's toes is if they don't have confidence in what someone else is doing. And sometimes that might be justified, and it might be the least worst outcome is to that person is messing up, therefore I'm going to intervene, etc. But fundamentally we all need to be good at our jobs and have that mutual trust, and in that sense I was I was sort of gently pleased that during the leadership election both Layla and Ed were quite rightly saying the party needs to change. There's a lot that we need to get right, a lot that went wrong in 2019 that we need to fix. But they also were not getting drawn into really micro detail about that. There was a sense of, yes, they are going to be very supportive, because, Layla as well is, continues to be an important senior figure in the party, that they're very supportive of the need for internal change, but also happy to let the other people and the other bits of the party that have responsibility for that to sort of get on with it. And as long as we collectively get on with it, then they're happy not to be meddling in all of that detail.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. With any kind of successful organisation, you need a degree of trust between those kind of three, like those key pillars. Now, I've worked in organisations before where the boardroom is being run basically with people competing against each other, and that then filters through, and it just causes chaos on the ground. But actually what you need there is both of you, all three of you, working together but trusting each other, that that person is getting on with their job and their team is going to be delivering of what's needed. And and that sounds like the absolute perfect way forward.
And that's also partly why, at the board, we decided to sort of press ahead with, the timescale in the Thornhill review for looking at governance changes and so on, and how we can improve how the parties run, rather than waiting for the new leader to be elected. Because, of course, it's really important that the new leader, that Ed now is happy to sort of fit in that sense with the way the parties run, rather than him deciding to go off and do his own thing. But also, one of the lessons from the Thornhill review fundamentally is don't put everything on the leader, and actually how the parties run, big elements of that are for the rest of us to sort out and get on with, and it's our responsibility. And I mention that because I know it's a question that came up a few times over the summer, is, well, why are we doing any of this before the leader gets elected? And the answer is, well, because not everything is the leader's job.
Yeah.
And I think that's might be worth just spending just 2 minutes here, just briefly say, okay, you've got the three roles we've mentioned, the leader, yourself as president, and the chief executive. What are, in as simple as we can, what are their roles within the party? And and I get we don't want to kind of completely prejudice the changes that might come along, but generally, how do you see those three roles and how they interact?
Let's see how good an answer I can give. I think that our leader is the sort of the public face of the party, and is the one who's primarily responsible for driving forward the vision and the political strategy. I think my role as president is to be the voice of the members and to oversee, because I chair the board and so on, to sort of lead and oversee the scrutiny operation, the scrutiny side of the party's operation, because the board is not there to do the job of party staff, it's there to oversee and so on. And then the chief executive, Mike's role is to head up the paid staff operation of the party. Actually, I should say it's to head up the paid staff isn't quite the right phrase, because volunteers play a really crucial role in some of the things. And actually, we probably, we need to make more and better use of volunteers. But Mike's job is to head up the professional administration, of the party.
That keeps everything ticking. Absolutely, yeah. So let's go on to Ed now. And so he has launched his listening exercise. Now, maybe this is me being a little bit cynical, and put me in my place, because I'm always happy to that to happen. So this is a listen exercise designed for the public rather than, say, Lib Dem members, because he's just done
47 hustings or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. And the Thornhill review was the chance for Lib Dems to say, okay, what has gone wrong in 2019 and beforehand?
Yeah, exactly.
So this is more about Lib Dems not being caught in little silos and being in an echo chamber, and actually understanding a little more of what's happening in the real world. Is that how you see it, Mark?
Yeah, and in a way, I see it as the equivalent of you probably do something like an annual resident survey in your wards, both in Preston, and in your patch as well, Tom. And that, we don't think, oh my goodness, this is awful, we're putting out a resident survey asking people their views rather than telling them what they should think. We recognise that actually hearing from people is really important, and that's because there are a lot of different choices in terms of what is the issue we should be talking about the most, and what's the issue we should be talking about the second most often. There are those are in a way pragmatic choices as to should we be spending more time talking about education, or should we be more time talking about welfare reform and improving the quality of the safety net there. Well, both are really important, both we want to do, both we can do a bit about, if we've got power at, say, local government level, both we want to be in power at Downing Street. Which is the one that should maybe get mentioned more often than the other? That, in the end, is a sort of a pragmatic, tactical question, where hearing what voters are saying most matters to them, really. The other thing is, I think, where we disagree with voters, where we want to persuade voters to change their mind, the best way to do that is to start with understanding where they're coming from. And I think this applies particularly to the European issue, that simply labelling people who disagree with us as all being bigots or racists or whatever that's not how we're going to win people over. That's not how we're going to build that majority support for winning out on the European issue in the long term. We actually need to understand why people are disagreeing with us, because some of them are very liberal, some of them are pretty pro-European as well. We need to understand that, and therefore we can work out how best to win them over.
Just to follow on that, I think it's a very kind of Liberal Democrat thing that actually, I think too often from our campaigns, over the last, I'd say 5 years, we've almost come with like solutions for people's problems and said like, this is how we do it, in a very kind of like metropolitan elite way, like move aside, we'll sort this out for you. But actually, the ethos of the Liberal Democrats is empowering people to kind of to tackle those problems themselves, and those communities to kind of face those problems and sort themselves out. But we have to give them the power, and the only way we do that is actually listening to people about what the issues are, and then we can help them tackle those issues. And so I think this listening exercise is a really good way, and it's a really good start to do this. And you're absolutely right. It did, again, whether it was Ed or Layla, both candidates made it very clear that that was the first process of their leadership that they were going to do.
And the European issue, I think, illustrates this most starkly, but it's not the only one by any means. And I think this is an area where actually environmental campaigners generally have got very smart at, the understanding that to win on environmental issues, you need to persuade people who are not immediately won over by just very stridently and passionately shouting how important the issue is. That actually winning people over to win the political debate, to actually help protect our environment, requires understanding where people are at, and therefore how to persuade them to change their mind. So, one of the things that often puts people off is a sense of, well, being green is somehow about being more expensive. And if you can understand then that gives an opening. Okay, there are ways we can tackle that, whether it's with the details of our policies or how we frame our arguments. There's an opening there to win people over. That simply shouting at them that it's awful, the world is going down in flames, doesn't get you very far.
Yeah, I'm going to be again a little bit cynical here. So the listening exercise that's going on, I mean, Lib Dems, as we know, from the people we like to talk to are generally other Lib Dems. So is this an actual, how does the party intend to go about this? Are we going to use polling companies? Because there are lots of companies that do a lot of work on issues and what matters. So how does what we're doing now as a party fit in with all the sorts of organisations that do this kind of professionally, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I think there will be lots of elements to this overall, and obviously they're being very rapidly collated at the moment. But as you rightly say, John, hearing the views of non-Lib Dem members is really important, as actually is hearing the views of, for example, small L liberals who didn't vote Lib Dem last year. There's an awful lot of them, and they should be really promising territory for us to win over, and we need to understand why. Why it was. And in some cases, it's relatively straightforward. In some cases, it's because, say, they live in a seat that they saw as being a Labour Tory marginal. And so they felt, that they couldn't vote for us. And the answer to that, therefore, might be an organisational thing, which is we need to build up our strength, win some more council seats in that seat, and therefore, next time round, have more chance of grabbing them. In other cases, it may be about learning what the best ways of persuading people. In other cases, it may be help give us some insights as to, well, what are we actually going to prioritise as the issues we want to talk about the most. So, for example, the NHS is massively important. Lib Dems are really strongly committed to it. We've varied a lot over elections how much we've spoken about the NHS, because you've got these two countervailing arguments. One is it's massively important as an issue, we therefore talk about it. And the other is the more you talk about it, the more people end up voting Labour because it's associated so closely. There's no great policy or principle difference between the two. It's about listening to voters, figuring out what's going to be most effective for the next election that's coming up, and then doing that, because in the end, if we can't win over voters, we don't get the power that comes with that. And all of those wonderful policy principles just end up being, well, things that we can say that we feel nice about, but we don't get the opportunity to make the real difference to people's lives. And that's in a way, that's the principled approach. It's to focus on what matters, ain't the nice words, it's the action that can make a difference to people's lives. How do we maximise the amount of action we can take?
And you just kind of made me think. We were having a chat. Me and my ward councillors do our weekly ward walks, because we can't knock on doors yet. So we do our ward walks. We get out in the ward and things like that. And we were just chatting about, and we had a new member join us, which is fantastic to join us.
Excellent,
and we're talking about why aren't the Lib Dems, say, massive on, we'll use your example of the NHS, for example. And I was talking, again, my marketing strategy said, there's two problems with it, really, in the sense that if there's a huge story about the NHS, the press will go for a government line and a Labour line, and we might not get on. So the conundrum we have as a third party or fourth party or any party that isn't the main two is that, do you go for niche issues where you are one of the lead voices on it, or do you go for major issues where your voice might not get heard above the cacophony? And that's a really difficult marketing strategy that the Lib Dems have got to handle.
Yeah, and in a way, the ideal policies are ones that matter to voters and where we have a view that is different from, in England, Labour and the Tories. Obviously, for example, in Scotland, you need to add in SNP to that and so on. Likewise in Wales. But there are not always that many issues that fall into that category. Because the matters to voters bit is a really important element of that. Now, we can definitely do work to persuade voters that something matters in a way that they didn't realise that it did. But we also need to be canny about our ability to do that as a relatively small party. We definitely can push open some doors that are a bit closed, but we've not got that, with 11 MPs, the amount of national media coverage that comes with that and so on, we've not got that battering ram power for the fully locked and bolted, door to charge that down. So we need, but the way in part I think about it is, if you think about a general election manifesto and all the different policies that we have in there, there's then a choice about which ones are we going to talk about when. That's the choice that should be really driven by pragmatism. And it doesn't in any way undermine the principal choice about what policies we put in the manifesto. You need both.
And I suppose, Tom, on a localised level, you'll do what I suppose lots of other Lib Dems around the country do. You try and get a national issue and then focus it locally and get that attention there. And that's what we do week in and week out, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely spot on. And that whole the whole process is, if you can have the best manifesto in the world, but if you don't win, then it's just a piece of paper with a load of words on it. And that's the whole process of this, is we've got to find a way to start winning elections. And you do that by campaigning and talking about the issues that the people who you want to buy into your product through votes, resonate with it. And as much as I would love to go into every election and be a liberal purist and talk about the issues that I really care about, the rules of the game, sorry to sound so cynical, don't allow for that to happen. And so, if we go onto that field into electoral politics, then we've got to play by those rules and start speaking to voters about the things that they care about. And then if we can then persuade them to vote for us, then we get, MPs elected, we get councillors elected, we start running councils and implementing the policies that we really care about. That's the way to, it's the only way to do this.
But I think it's also the principled approach, because in a democracy, voters get to choose what matters most. And I mean, that's the thing that's different between one of the things that's different between a democracy and a dictatorship. In a dictatorship, the dictator tells people what matters. In a democracy, people get to choose. There is, I've no doubt, a West Wing quote. In fact, I think there is a West Wing quote along those lines, because I think Ed and I put it in one of our chapters, 101 Ways to Win an Election. But what that is one of the fundamental features of a democracy, is voters get to choose what matters to them when they make up their mind how to vote. And, in that sense, respecting that, I think, is it's part of what should make people who are seeking public support humble in a democracy, because the voters get that choice, and that is wonderful that the voters get that choice, and we need to be humble enough to respect that that's where the power lies. That's what we need to respect, and therefore that's what we need to understand. And of course, that understanding might then lead to, okay, well, actually, we think we need to change people's minds, and therefore this is how we go about doing it. Immigration would be, I think, a really good example, which is that depending on how you ask the question, there are a lot of people that you can get either an anti-immigration sounding answer or a pro-immigration sounding answer from. And in that sense, they're the swing voters. You know, they're on this issue. They're the deciding group. And, you know, starting with listening to them to understand what some of their concerns are is the way to then win them over. And, you know, so one of the things, you often hear is people thinking that wrongly, that immigration puts a burden on our public services. So, okay, you hear that, you can then understand the way to respond is highlighting, for example, how dependent the NHS is on people who have come to this country relatively recently and how wonderful. And, you know, and I've done this on the doorstep. When you get into that sort of conversation with somebody, you've then got a chance of persuading them. But if you started from, oh, you said something a bit iffy about immigration, therefore you're a racist, we don't want your support, you end up losing them.
I think that's the two words you use there, Mark, respect and understand. That's the key thing I think that was missing from our European campaign, is that you can respect someone's point of view and you can understand their point of view, but you don't necessarily have to agree with them. But what we did is we jumped straight into disagreeing with someone rather than showing that, A, we respected someone's view for wanting to leave the EU and understanding why they took that view. Because then if we take those two approaches, we can then navigate a way to communicate our message to kind of help them move to our side.
And I think that was in part the difference between the success of our European election campaign and the failure of our general election campaign, is that people who disagreed with us in the European election campaign could nonetheless respect the fact that we were saying, look, this is a big issue, the country's divided, it happens that we've got a different view from you on that. You know, that's you can imagine that's a not particularly confrontational thing to say. What I think was part of what happened in the 2019 election campaign was that it sounded like we were taking that difference, and rather than treating that difference as we're being clear about what we believe, but also that we were parlaying that into being almost sort of harsh and sort of condescending, you know, even maybe in part how it came over at times. And in that respect, you know, I think the word revoke is quite a harsh word, for example, you know, and I think when it's a choice between revoke or no deal, that maybe would have played out differently. But when it came a choice then between revoke or a deal, you can see how some of that harsh. And that's why I think if you look at the polling around the revoke policy, the polling continued to be quite good all the way up until polling day. But the point was, it's not just that issue in itself, it's that broader outlook. And I think that's the difference, is that although we were ruder with our slogan in the European elections, there was nonetheless a sense of, that's what this choice is. So we're being clear what our choice is, and people can respect that difference. Whilst come the general election, it just seemed more, possibly also because the amount of noise from outriders, many of whom may even have not Lib Dems, but pro-European, not Lib, of just that sort of, if you're not with us, you're horrible, which interestingly didn't really come through, I think, in the same way in the European election campaign. So,
and I think almost like we planned this, which is, as everyone knows, listening to the Lib Dem podcast, there is no planning goes into it whatsoever. But it does lead us in to actually something that's just happened. And so for all listeners and viewers, we are recording this on Monday morning. And what's happened overnight is that it looks like the government is heading for a no deal, to announce some sort of no deal. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But, a no deal outcome in terms of their trade negotiations. And from that, we've also had a lot of stuff online regarding what the Lib Dem position should be. Regarding, and to be honest, I'm a little surprised by some of this controversy online, because both Layla and Ed were absolutely in lockstep about the Lib Dem position right now. It is neither helpful or useful to be, we want to rejoin the EU straight away. And I mean, you always get the odd voice, but actually I didn't see any swell of opinion saying, right, the rejoin now kind of campaign. Now, but that's only come up now, where Lib Dems are saying, look, we have to now go on to rejoin now. That should be our stance. And how do you deal with that, Mark? I mean, for me personally, and for my local party, we did a kind of a straw poll, and not a single person came back as saying we want to rejoin now. I say a couple said, we might want to think about it for the next general election being our policy, but the vast majority said this isn't for now. Yeah. So what are your take on it, Mark?
I think so. I mean, in terms of my own view, I'm very much in favour of Britain being a member of the European Union. We will be worse off. We are already worse off out of it. We will be even worse off when the transition period comes to an end at the end of this year. And I want Britain to, be back in the EU as soon as is possible. The question is, what does as soon as possible mean? And I think for reasons similar to what you've said, John, I am deeply sceptical that if on January the 2nd next year we say, right, transition period's over, we now want Britain to rejoin the EU straight away, I'm deeply sceptical that will work. And I think the risk is not only that it doesn't work, that it ends up damaging the pro-European cause, when actually a smarter approach of saying, okay, we're out. We still believe in Britain being in the EU. That's our long-term objective. But our short-term objective now is, for example, to campaign on closer links to maybe get Britain to rejoin Euratom and, other ways of keeping the links close and trying to make them closer. I think that's going to be much more successful. The other thing I would say, though, is that there is, if, let's say, maybe we end the transition period with no deal and things go really disastrously, it might be public opinion moves much quicker than is implicit in what I've just said, in which case, fine. I mean, let's not forget the next general election is quite a long time away. So we've got a bit of time to see how things pan out and to work out, what sort of level of nuance is sensible to add to we want Britain to rejoin the EU as soon as practical. I think what can make people nervous is if they feel that there isn't that clear long-term commitment. I think if you know that all of us really want Britain to be in the EU as soon as it's practical, you can have a discussion about what as soon as practical means. And you might have some very different answers to that amongst people, but you can do that in a much more positive, collegiate way than if actually some people are doubting whether you really want to be in the EU at all. And are you therefore using the as soon as practical as sort of a lever to try and, get away from the long-term objective. And so I think that's important that we continue to be clear and to reassure people that, our long-term objective is for Britain to be in the EU. And I think as long as we do that, there is then that space to have that sensible discussion about, well, okay, so what's the way we get the most pro-European results out of 2021? What's the and there'll be some differences of opinions on that, but we, and that's inevitable. But I think it's going to be pretty clear that calling immediately to rejoin the EU from January the 2nd is really unlikely to be that route. And the one thing I would just say as well is I think, and obviously Twitter is not the real world and all of that, but I was quite amused at the person who responded to me saying something quite similar to what I've just said on Twitter, who says they're a pro-European. I guess they are. I've no reason to doubt. Their account didn't particularly look like it was a bot and it wasn't located in Moscow or anything like that. Who therefore concluded that, well, maybe I was really a closet leaver. There is an onus on all of us as pro-Europeans to sort of say, okay, we might disagree with each other a bit on tactics, but we shouldn't therefore turn that into some great, well, if you don't exactly agree on what, on when it is that we think Britain is going to be able to rejoin the EU, if you've got, if you pick a different date from me, therefore you are somehow unclean and therefore are really a Tory and, should be cast out and so on, is that there's a danger that in people's enthusiasm, therefore, of actually weakening the cause if they're not willing to engage constructively with people who pick, some different dates in that sense from the ones they would.
And Tom, I suppose it's an argument about people who believe themselves to be ideologically pure or like kind of or dogmatic in sense of it that, for me personally, I think there's a real risk is if you could really damage the EU movement if you seem to ignore what the electorate has just been telling us, for particularly in 2019. And actually, the Lib Dems have got to be strategic about this and not let the best be the enemy of good. If we can get a better kind of relationship than the current no deal going forward, then that is better than sticking your head in the sand and driving off. And we talked about just before, driving off voters by not feeling like you're listening to them. Yeah. And I think that's where Lib Dems have got to be, particularly those who are, I mean, you won't find more passionate pro-Europeans than probably the three of us on this thing. But it's how we get the result we need. And sometimes it's a little bit of realpolitik, the fact that if you go for this now, you're probably going to cause more harm than good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm still heartbroken at the referendum result. I think it was a mistake to hold the referendum. I still go back to that morning of waking up and seeing Nigel Farage celebrating. It's just one of my worst days in politics. That it was just awful. But then equally, I knocked on several doors in the 2019 general election, and what threw me is there were Liberal Democrat voters who were pro-European themselves, but they were saying to us, but this is not the will of the people, or it's not the, so if we're not bringing those people with us who you'd think were actually, they were like geg on to be supporting us, then that is the wider problem. And I saw some of the stuff on Twitter with certain people saying they'd left, and there is a little bit of Twitter warrior about it, if I must say, which probably sums up the problems with the Remain campaign generally. And it goes back to our point that we made before. There are rules to the playing field that all political parties are on. And if you don't listen to the electorate and you don't court their support, and you don't, as Mark said, they're the ultimate rulers on who governs and who doesn't. It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter where you were born or what communities you're from. You have one vote, and that vote matters as much as the next person. If you don't win that person's vote, then you don't get to change the course and the direction of this country. So that's the whole point of this. I don't think anyone can say that Liberal Democrats are not pro-European. We will have pro-European stuff in our manifesto, I am sure. And, there is both candidates, Ed and Layla, said that, they wanted to be a part of the EU. And when the time was right, they would campaign to rejoin. But that's the key point, is when the time is right. And at the moment, we've got to listen to people and heal some of those wounds that the Brexit referendum caused.
I'd just add quickly, actually, one other point, which is that one of the reasons why campaigning for closer links with the European Union is important is both in itself, it will make the end of the transition period less bad, still bad, but less bad. It also, though, makes rejoining the EU at a future date easier because the smaller the gap that then has to be bridged in future negotiations to rejoin, the easier that process will be. And so there is something quite important about saying, look, we can, if there are particular issues that we can pick off, that is helping the longer term objective. It's not an alternative to, it's a sort of a short term salve, but also it's helping achieve the long term objective.
Absolutely. And of course, if you disagree with the three of us, which you are perfect as Lib Dems, it is within your right. There is a conference motion in the virtual conference about this. You can have your say, you can have your vote. That is the point of our party. If you vehemently disagree with us, you have your say. And I suppose
I suspect on that motion, I mean, we'll see what happens, but my guess is that, there's a very good chance we'll end up with a form of words that basically everyone is happy on. Because, I don't think there's anyone who's saying we should stop being a pro-European party. There is, there's a bit of wordsmithing to be done, but definitely you can see a form of words which covers that we're pro-European and we want us to be back in the EU as soon as possible. And we'll judge that as events come as to what that means in practice. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to sort of unite around that position.
Just on that, if you end up, cancelling your direct debit for the want of 2,000 likes on Twitter, then you don't get a vote in that council conference motion. So, good work.
I think we'll start to draw this episode to a close. I mean, there's lots of things to discuss going forward, and hopefully we can do another joint episode. I mean, particularly in terms of now that the leader's in place, we have monster elections next year.
Yeah,
and you know, Mark, as you said, you are kind of the voice of the members. Well, a lot of our members, like myself, have huge elections next year, and actually, what we can do as a party, what is the HQ going to do? Because that's the next big test.
Yeah, definitely.
That's the big one.
It's a mammoth set of elections. And you know, particularly if you think about the Scottish element to those elections, I mean, the future of the country is literally at stake. I mean, I think it's probably a staple of every eve of poll, you know, election campaign messaging about, you know, the stakes have never been higher than, you know, you must vote tomorrow by 10 p.m. But there is a sense of, you know, these elections have an importance well above and beyond the usual round of elections, partly because of the Scottish dimension and partly because of it's 2 years worth of elections rolled into one, and the point at which it will be happening a few months after, you know, the end of the transition period, the first set of elections since, you know, we've elected our leader, a couple of weeks ago and so on. That it's a really big, important test and a really big and important opportunity to get more Lib Dems into power. You know, at the moment, we've got Kirsty as a minister in Wales. We've got 50 Lib Dem council leaders or co-leaders around the country. You know, if we can increase those sorts of numbers, then that's a whole group of people who, from the day after the election, can start exercising more power to make more communities more liberal and more democratic. And that's what it's all about.
And it's the first test of the Johnson government as well. This is really, so it will be seen. I mean, and it's really important as well. 2017, when I got elected to Lancashire County Council, that was despite the general election that happened a couple of weeks afterwards, that was a pretty high mark for the Tories.
You are the silver lining to the year of 2017, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Mark. I'll take that. Yeah.
It's a small silver lining, but a very valuable silver lining.
But it is absolutely our chance. And what you should be saying to any members who are feeling a little bit down or disappointed, or listeners who think their first test isn't in 2024, it's next year. Exactly. And we have an absolute chance to change the story. And don't forget, 2019 local elections, which were our best ever, pretty much ended Theresa May. Now, how nice would it be for Lib Dems to put a check onto Boris Johnson and this government next year?
And particularly if you look at just how fractious the Tory backbenchers are, you know, there's a real opportunity. Although the Tories nominally have a big majority, there's a real opportunity to massively put the government on the back foot, because they've got they've handled the backbench MPs really badly. The relations are already really fractious. You add in a bit of smell of political fear to that as well, and the world politically could look very, very different from how it felt the day after the last general election.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, both Tom and Mark, and thank you very much, listeners. I'll just give a quick shout out. So, Tom, you can find him on Twitter at Thomas Morrison. You go for the full Thomas for that one, just in case. Did your mum set up your Twitter account?
Because everyone is so disapproving of what I say on Twitter, they might as well have that kind of mom response to me. Yeah.
And of course, you can follow the wonderful Mark Pack at Mark Pack, and the Bar Charts Podcast at Bar Charts Podcast. You can follow myself at John Potter LD, and the Lib Dem Podcast at Lib Dem Pod. Thank you so much, both of you, for being on. Thank you to all the listeners and viewers. Do, again, like and follow and subscribe. Do comment on anything you hear. We welcome debate. We absolutely do welcome debate. And if you disagree with us, we like to hear that as well, because
we're listening.
You know, absolutely, listen. That is our mantra at the moment, is that we're listening, almost like Fraser Crane. But thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back with more episodes on the Bar Chart Podcast and the Lib Dem Podcast very soon. But have a good rest of your day, and thank you very much for listening.
Cheers. Thank you.